Thanks, Doug. Hi, everybody, and good afternoon. Like Doug said, my name is BJ Bowley. I am with the Michigan State Climate Office at Michigan State University, and I'm also a climatologist with the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment. So that's the NOAA RISA for the Great Lakes region. And yeah, we've got quite a bit to cover today, so I'm going to try and get through it all in the time allotted. But just before we get going, these webinars are kind of an important service brought to the Central region by all of those partners you see listed there on the screen and that Doug mentioned during his interview. For those looking ahead to next month, the next Climate Drought Outlook webinar will be held on December 20th, 2018 at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, and the presenter will be Justin Gleason, who is the Iowa State climatologist. If you haven't personally registered for these webinars or want to get more information about upcoming ones, the link's there on your screen, and the archives are available from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Center at the links there below. And like I said, hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So the agenda for today, I'm going to go over the recent conditions. So what we saw during the last year to date, October, and the last 30 days kind of moving into November. Kind of present the broad sweep of impacts that we've gotten from our contributors throughout the region. And then we'll finish up with the outlooks, both addressing El Nino, which I'm sure you've all heard a lot about in the news and a lot of interest about for the winter, and then the winter season in general. So starting with the recent conditions, a look back at the last 30 days to month or so to year to date. If we look at October across the region, kind of stretching from Montana all the way out east to Ohio there, we kind of see a change from what we've seen the last few months. Most of the states in the region, particularly those in the north central portion, are showing below average to much below average temperatures when compared to the mean from 1895 to 2018. Actually, North Dakota kind of sticks out there with its 12th coldest October on record. Missouri, Illinois, Indiana were all near average, and as we move out to the east, Ohio is still sitting there above average. On the whole, the country, I believe, was 0.29 degrees Fahrenheit below the long-term, the 20th century average for the month of October. So we did have a below average month for temperatures. In context, the year to date, that those cool temperatures in October kind of pulled a lot of the region back into the near average category for average temperatures year to date, so January through October 2018. Wyoming's still above average, as is much of the central and eastern portion of the regions, with Ohio there still being much above average. And then Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky are all sitting above average. And South Dakota is our coolest state year to date in terms of the rankings. So that's sitting there at its 38th coolest month year to date on record. And I realize it didn't explain for some of those who may not know, lower number on these maps indicates colder. So if that number was to display a 1 on these states, that would be the record coldest for that time period on record. And if there's 124, since there's 124 years of data, that would be the record warmest, like what we're seeing in Arizona and New Mexico year to date. So that is their record warmest year on record. Moving from temperature into precipitation, story across the central region is it's been pretty wet the month of October. Much of this came in the first half of the month, which you'll see as we move into the last 30 days here in a few minutes. But yeah, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Colorado were all above average, as were Minnesota, Missouri, and Illinois, while Kansas, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan are all coming in at much above average. And then there were no below average states in our region for the month of October. Montana, Wyoming, Indiana, and Ohio and Kentucky all came in at near average for their statewide precipitation ranks for the month of October. And it's a lot of the same when we move into looking at the year-to-date numbers for precipitation ranks. So from January through October for 2018, much of the region has either been near average to above average to much above average. Particularly the farther east you go in the region, those months are this year has been quite wet. So that's that's kind of been the story so far this year, especially since the summer. I know we were talking about some drought concerns, but this fall we've really moved into that really wet category with some of those pretty heavy rainfalls that we saw at the end of September into October and are continuing in some parts of the region. So as we look back at the last 30 days, so since the last webinar through present, much of the region we're seeing had experienced below average temperatures. The western part of the region there's a few spots where, they're 0 to 2 degrees above normal for that period. But most of the region west of the Missouri Missouri River in Nebraska, the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming are averaging anywhere from 0 to 4 degrees below normal. And then as we move east, we see some pretty outstanding cold temperatures, particularly centered around southeast Missouri, but kind of radiating out from there across portions of Indiana and Illinois, and even stretching up into Ohio and parts of Michigan, where we're running anywhere from 4 degrees to 6 degrees below normal. That's that light blue color you see there on the map. And then even getting cooler, some areas are running as much as 10 degrees below normal there in southeast Missouri for that 30-day period. So pretty cool temperatures, not a lot of above average temperatures across the region in the last 30 days. And as we move into looking at precipitation, like I'd mentioned previously, the region was really wet at the beginning of the early month of October. We have seen drier conditions in the western portions of the central region. So if you look, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Kansas, all have had areas where they're running 25 to 50% of normal precipitation. Some spots have been even a little bit lower than that. In that eastern portion on the right side of your map there, we drew a red line. And east of there, we've seen pretty above normal precipitation. A lot of those areas running at 150 to some areas 200% of normal precipitation for that 30-day period. Southeast Colorado as well has been running above normal. One caveat about this, since this is expressed in percent of normal precipitation and not inches, it doesn't take a whole lot of water to flip that number and get above normal precipitation, since we are kind of entering our drier period of the year where we don't get nearly as much liquid precipitation. And when we do get precipitation in the northern parts, a lot of it falls as snow. So building off this very wet October and kind of showing, even with that drier last 30 days, another way to look at this is soil moisture across the basin. So this is a model of how much water is in the soil column below the surface of the earth. And what we see is that across, there's some areas, northern North Dakota, some spots in western South Dakota and northwest Minnesota, where we do see some drier than average soil moisture conditions. But if you look across the broad majority of the region, these numbers are running at 100 plus millimeters anomaly. So it's just really wet. There's a lot of water in that soil profile, especially areas in northwest Iowa, across northern Iowa there into Wisconsin, and then as well as down into Kentucky and lots of parts of Ohio and Indiana, and even parts of Michigan are running well above the historical normal for soil moisture, so how much water is in the ground. One thing about this, Dennis wanted me to mention, this is a modeled product, so this is not done from direct observation. So he mentioned he posted the same map on Twitter the other day, and one of those white areas in Minnesota, somebody from there got a hold of him, and there was a picture of standing water in their field. So this isn't a perfect product, but it gives us a good idea of what's going on across the basin in terms of how much water is in the soil. And then another way to look at this is looking at stream flow across the region. So this is kind of a way to quantify how much water is draining into the rivers, either from surface water or groundwater sources, and measuring how much water is moving through the river systems in these regions. One thing you'll notice that this is a little less than last month, but there still are a lot of those black dots on the map there, which means these rivers are running extremely high. So there's a lot of water moving through the system. The blues are still above the 90th percentile for flow. So a lot of blues, a lot of light blues, and a lot of blacks on this map shows there's just a lot of water running through the system. And this is really big as we're going into our freeze-up season, as we're locking moisture into the soil. The soils are freezing up. Rivers are going to be icing up sooner than later. And the amount of water in the system now is a lot of that will be there in spring when we thaw out. So this could come back in a few months and really see it in terms of flooding concerns as we move into spring and snowmelt happens, depending on what happens with our winter precipitation across the region. All of this translating into what's happened with the drought monitor. So right now on the screen, we're showing the National Drought Monitor for the North National Weather Service Central Region. And what this is a product that gives an indicator of the status of drought in a region, ranging from abnormally dry conditions at D0, that's that light yellow color you'll see there on the map, all the way up to D4, which is exceptional drought, which there's the southwest corner of Colorado there that is still experiencing a pretty substantial drought, and they have been for quite some time this year. They've been struggling with drought in Colorado. Broadly across the region, there are still some lingering areas of D1 drought up in north central North Dakota, some abnormally dry conditions adjacent to that, northwest Minnesota, western North Dakota, extending somewhat down into South Dakota, and patches in Montana as well. A few patches of abnormally dry conditions in eastern Kansas there and Missouri. But by and large across the region, we're not seeing a lot of drought stress right now, not a lot of drought pressure. What drought was out there last month, a lot of that has shown improvement. That's what this next map is showing. So this is showing the class change in the U.S. Drought Monitor for the past month. Gray colors there equal that it hasn't changed. The green colors there, different gradations of green, show 1 or 2 class improvements in certain regions. So if there was, say, a D1, and it's that second dark green color, that would mean there's now no drought there, or 2 classes better. The only place we've really seen some degradation across the region is in Wyoming there, where there's a little patch where it's seen about a 1 class decrease in drought, and going back, there wasn't drought there, and now they're showing abnormally dry conditions. So that's kind of where we're sitting at with drought moving into November and going into December. I didn't have it on the screen here, but if any of you remember from this summer, it was a lot different picture. Drought concerns were pretty strong across the region, and that was a big concern with all the rain we've gotten in September, October, and even some places sustaining into November, led to drought improvement across the region. That, going into our next couple sections, we'll talk about impacts. We'll touch on that again later. And it's everyone's favorite time of year. So when we talk about precipitation now, we are going to start talking about snowfall. So on the screen there is the snow depth map from NOHORSE, National Operational Hydrologic Remote Sensing Center, which is a NOAA group out of Minnesota that handles most of the snow data for the country and does aerial surveys and modeling and satellite data. And just showing that in the northern stretches of the region, so across North Dakota, Minnesota, into Wisconsin, and really up in the upper peninsula of Michigan, and even extending down to the lower, there's snowpack that is starting to be established. And the storm system that just moved across Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and kind of up the Ohio River Valley there, dropped a substantial amount of snow as well. So this can change a lot. It's still quite early in the snow season, but it is something we're going to have to start talking about and seeing what happens with snowfall moving forward from now. And then one other thing we'll be concerned about, just wanted to start, this product's being issued again now that we're going into our winter season. And that'll be looking into the mountains for the snowpack and how much water is being stored in that snow as we move through the season. That will become important as we move into spring and that snow starts melting. And then we have to be concerned about river levels, potential for flooding, especially with all that soil moisture in the upper Missouri River Basin right now, in the eastern Dakotas, in Iowa, for the Mississippi. That's something we will have to monitor as the season progresses. Right now, the basins that drain into the Missouri are showing, about normal snowpack for snow water equivalent for the season so far. There's a few that are above, but I'll stress again, this is really early, so this will change. But just wanted to put this out there. This is a product that's available if people want to get a taste for what's out there, see what's happening with the snowpack in the mountains as we move through winter into the spring. So with that was a brief look back at the impacts or the conditions across the basin. Moving into impacts. So what does this all mean? We've seen cooler than normal temperatures. We've seen wet weather. We started to see snow across the region. Aaron from the Ohio State Climate Office, his friend just sent us this picture from Waukesha, Wisconsin, and that's, showing apples on the trees with snow cover. So snow is kind of a reoccurring theme in this webinar and will be throughout the winter. But moving into what the impacts were, 2018 has been exceptionally wet. So when we look across the Central Basin, we just wanted to see where stations were standing up in terms of total calendar year precipitation. And what we found is that there's a bunch of stations across the region that are in their going towards their wettest year on record. You'll see there on the screen that column that says rank. What that means is currently, as of the 13th of November, if it were to stop raining at those locations and no more rain or snow fell till the end of the year, that would be the rank of where it falls in the wettest year on record. So if that would be a 1, that would be the wettest year on record. So far, a couple ones to call out, specifically top 3, Waterloo, Iowa has seen 51 inches of rain so far this year. As of the 13th of that month, that would put it in line for its second wettest year on record. Sioux Falls, South Dakota has seen almost 38 inches of rain. The same, it would put it in that second position for wettest year on record. And then Madison, Wisconsin and Lexington, Kentucky, both also are ranking in right up there in the top 3 years so far. These could move and become the wettest years on record depending what happens in the next few weeks. And what's more impressive about this is that most of these stations are pretty long records. They're going on 120, 130 plus years of data. So 2018 as a whole has been a pretty remarkable year in amount of rainfall that has fallen. If you're kind of more interested in the spatial distribution of that, on the bottom right of your screen there, we have a map showing the percent of normal precipitation from the first of the year through the 13th. And a lot of these stations fall in that region that's purple, kind of stretching from Valentine, Nebraska there in the north central part of Nebraska, extending all the way over to Lake Michigan, where we've seen anywhere from 150 to more than 175% of normal precipitation for that period. So building on that, some additional sites that are approaching wettest years on record that were sent to us by some of our collaborators is Belfour, South Dakota is approaching its 7th wettest year on record with the current amount of rainfall that's fallen. Hays, Kansas is currently the 4th wettest year on record. Liberal, Kansas, 9th wettest year on record. Then some others, Redbird, Wyoming is currently at the 3rd wettest year on record. And 2 stations that we were sent have currently had their wettest year on record with the amount of precipitation that has fallen to date. Those are Yankton, 2 East in South Dakota. It's had 39.71 inches of rain as of the 13th. And then Elizabeth, Illinois has had 56.38 inches of rain. That is the wettest year on record. This one's a little shorter period of record. Most of these other ones are 100-year stations or close to. Elizabeth only goes back to 1984, but that precipitation total is pretty spectacular, so we wanted to point it out here. Into more direct impacts rather than just precipitation records, the wet weather at the beginning of October had a pretty substantial impact on harvest of a lot of crops. With the drier conditions in the last few weeks, we've seen improvements with that. The corn harvest progress in the U.S. Is varying in the central Midwest, so Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and down to Missouri are actually running a little bit ahead of the 5-year averages for the amount of corn harvested in those states. The Dakotas are running a bit behind. South Dakota is 14% below, as is North Dakota 16% behind the 5-year average. And then the rest of the region is a little bit behind, but in the single digits, a couple percentages behind the 5-year average. But that dry weather in the last few weeks in the western reaches of the basin have really allowed a lot of this to pick up. A note from South Dakota as well, you see that 14% below the 5-year average. There's been some really wet areas where there's been reports from farmers that they're waiting for the ground to freeze before they'll move heavy machinery into some of these fields where there's a lot of very wet conditions. So that could be one reason that's a little bit more behind there. Moving west into the plains, looking at sorghum harvest as of November 11th. The big sorghum producing state, our number 1 producer in Kansas, is running about 18% behind normal. The 5-year average, when I say normal, 21% behind in Colorado. South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma are all running a little bit behind. And then Illinois is actually a little bit ahead of the progress in sorghum with about 2% above the 5-year average. Soybeans has been one that's had a lot of conversation. So moving into how soybeans have been progressing and how that harvest has come along, the story across the region is it's behind the 5-year average, though there again has been an increase in the last few weeks with those drier conditions. Across the Dakotas and some of the northern tier and into Nebraska and Iowa, they're running at almost soybean harvest is almost complete. They're showing 94 to 96, 97% complete in those states. In Michigan and Ohio, with the continued wet weather and the cool conditions, the harvest has been slower here. We're running about 10% behind the 5-year average. Kansas and Missouri, kind of same story, running 16 and 15% behind the 5-year average. So that has been a little bit slow. And in some cases, that pickup in the last few weeks has made those numbers look a little more complete than they would be otherwise. So some numbers set to us by Brad Rippey with the World Ag Outlook Board. The U.S. soybean harvest for this year, as of this was about, I believe, November 9th when these numbers were sent, is the third slowest on record in the modern era since about 1995 through present. So it is on the slower end of harvest, though. That if you look at that chart on the right there, that red line is 2018, and you'll notice about the middle of October through the beginning of November, those exceptionally wet conditions in the early part of the month really brought that harvest and slowed it down. It's the slowest since 2009. There have been some improvements in recent weeks. And to quote one of our other contributors, harvest season is a lousy time of year for drought improvement to take place. So the fact that a lot of the regions are experiencing drought stress is a good thing, but the timing of year made harvest difficult for a lot of producers across the region. Moving from harvesting into planting, a lot of people are trying to get their winter wheat in for the fall, and a lot of people have got it in the Dakotas and Nebraska, looking at 92 and 96%. Oh, this is winter wheat emerged, excuse me. It echoes the amount planted is dragging behind the 5-year average in a lot of cases. South Dakota and Nebraska are showing their winter wheat planting is pretty much complete, but the other regions where they're still trying to get that in, they're a few percentage points behind the 5-year average. And once that wheat's in the ground, trying to get it out and emerged is the next step. And across the region, most states are running behind the 5-year average, especially in Michigan here. We're running about 17% behind the 5-year average. And since that hard freeze has taken place, we're starting to get frozen soils and the ground's really firming up. There are a lot of producers I know around here we've been talking with that are not planning on planting anymore. So there'll be fewer acres planted in winter wheat in Michigan. And I know Indiana has said, we've had reports of the same thing going on down there. Some specific impacts that were sent from our stakeholders across the region. As far as state impacts, again, those cool temperatures from the past several weeks are one that everybody noted. Minnesota is one worth calling out, is that the first 13 days of November ran average 7.7 degrees Fahrenheit below normal. Flip side of this, in Michigan, those cooler temperatures have created good conditions for beet piling for sugar beets. So when they harvest out of the field, they store them in piles, and the cooler conditions have been beneficial for that. Again, a lot of the wet conditions that were reported across the region in early October and continuing through October into November in the central and eastern portions really slowed down that harvest for a lot of crops. There have been some improvements in recent weeks. Except some of our producers in South Dakota have said they're waiting for soils to freeze in particularly wet areas before they'll move machinery into the fields to get those crops out. The wet weather in Michigan and the eastern parts of the basin have also led to poor grain drying in the field. So grain's not drying as it's sitting in the field, and that may lead to increased costs for producers when they take it to elevators to sell. One note from South Dakota, sunflower harvest is about on time with the 5-year average. And given how wet the soils are in some areas of the basin and the difficulty getting the crops out of the field, I wanted to point this out. One of our contributors said a quote from a news article that the biggest seller they're seeing in their area from farm stores and co-ops is log chains to pull out tractors and combines. So machinery was going into wet fields in some cases and getting stuck. In terms of winter wheat impacts from the cooler and wetter conditions, there was some flood damaging reported in Kansas for emerging winter wheat, as well as a reduced number of acres being planted in Indiana and Michigan. The wet and cool temperatures also have been attributed to some grain quality and disease issues we're seeing over the region. There were some concerns reported about soybeans dropping pods, swelling and sprouting in the pods, sent to us from Nebraska, Iowa, Ohio, and then also in Michigan. In Indiana, there was some soybean docking attributed to stink bug damage and fungal issues. And then one big one that we're currently dealing with in Michigan is reports of vomitoxin in corn. So that's a toxin that gets into corn and basically makes if it's too high a concentration, basically makes the crop unsaleable at the elevator for feed. It can be used in some cases for biofuel and ethanol, but then that distiller's grain can't be sold for feed. There's been some reports of people, the infection's been bad enough in portions of east central Michigan where people have plowed crops under. They're just calling it a loss for the season. This is particularly noteworthy. It's the second outbreak of this in the last couple of years. 2016 also had some substantial reports of that in Michigan. As far as some other impacts from across the region, again, with the cooler weather, there was some lack of growing degree days in Kansas that led to some sorghum crops and soybean crops not being mature at the time they froze. So that's the impact there. Kind of moving away from temperature and precipitation for a second, there's also been some wind damage reports from across the region. There were some power outages and damage reported in Cuyahoga County in Ohio on election day, so that's right around Cleveland, as well as some corn blowdown in areas across northern two-thirds of Indiana and regions. Again, with soil starting to freeze across the region, snow covers getting established, had reports from some of our northern states as well as Nebraska in there. Another thing, with the cooler temperatures, ice up has been reported on smaller lakes in South Dakota and Minnesota. From the Minnesota State Climatology Office, they were saying that's about 3 weeks early, give or take, for the lakes across the state. And then reports from some of the people in northeast South Dakota that we've spoken to say that their ice up's occurring about on average for the smaller lakes. And then one last impact that was sent to us I wanted to include here, roadside pheasant counts in South Dakota. So ANR drives around and does pheasant counts to get an estimate on the population. They're up 47%. So pheasants are in good shape in South Dakota. Moving from the individual impacts into the Missouri River, this is a big concern going into winter with all that water on the landscape, just kind of the status of the system. Runoff reported from rivers, particularly in eastern South Dakota, was reported as being the second highest for a month in any month on record for October of this year. The first highest runoff was actually reported in September of this year. So the last 2 months have seen exceptionally high runoff from eastern South Dakota into the Missouri River below Gavin's Point. The rivers that they were talking about here are specifically the James, the Vermilion, and Big Sioux. But I mean, this is kind of the tale across the entire region. The graph on the right there shows the amount of storage in the Missouri River system. That red line is showing 2018. The black line is showing 2011, which was a pretty big flood year in the summer. But really, they're trying to still move those 2018 floodwaters through the system. So the runoff forecast has been high. They're still releasing more water than they typically would be this time of year. They're projecting that releases will be above average through November, and that's to get the bulk of this storm or floodwater through the system before they have to reduce the winter releases due to river ice up and lake ice up. Yeah, 2018 is going to be a banner year for runoff. So far, it's looking like it will be the third highest year on record for the upper Missouri River Basin, behind 1997 and 2011 as a total. Moving into the Great Lakes water levels are running high on all 5 of the lakes. That graph there on the right is showing Great Lakes water levels for Lake Superior at Marquette, Michigan. So that blue line there, that squiggly line, is 2018, the daily levels for this year. The black line right there is the daily levels from last year. Those blue stepped lines are our monthly record highs. The green stepped line is the average value for the month, and the brown line there would be the record low. But yeah, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Lake Erie are all near last year's levels, which are in the upper percentiles of what's been observed on those lakes. Lake Ontario is somewhat lower than the same time in 2017. They've got a little more control over the water level in that lake due to the St. Lawrence River and the outflow there, but it's still above the long-term mean. The forecasts that are out there from our friends at Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab and Environment and Climate Change Canada suggest that the next 6 months, the levels on all 5 of the Great Lakes will remain above the long-term averages. That average is taken from 1918 through present, so it's a fairly long record. And in terms of temperatures, as we're moving into winter, if people are concerned about ice cover on the Great Lakes, there's no real ice cover to report yet, or no substantial ice cover anyway. But the surface water temperatures on all the Great Lakes are actually near normal to slightly below. So we're actually dealing with some cooler water in the Great Lakes Basin as far as surface temperatures go. One positive impact, could say, for the year for the Great Lakes with this cooler fall and some of the conditions that prevailed over the regions was that the algal bloom in Lake Erie that you typically hear about in late summer, where it impacts drinking water in Toledo and the western portion of the basin and water quality all across the basin, was actually quite a bit less severe than had been predicted. They were predicting a fairly, moderately severe bloom, and it actually ended up being pretty mild, especially when compared to recent years. So that's one impact from the region itself, the Great Lakes. That was some kind of good news moving into the winter season. Just to summarize the conditions from what's recently been observed and the impacts, cooler temperatures have been observed across the region, particularly in the central areas, the Missouri, as well as the upper and mid-Mississippi rivers continue to flow higher than average for this time of year. Cold and wet conditions impacted harvesting and planting, though with that dry down in recent weeks, we've seen some improvements and some speed up in getting those crops out of the field. People are really trying to get those out before winter sets in. Lake levels for the Great Lakes are above their long-term averages and likely to continue to be high. And then moving into spring, again, can't really stress this enough, flooding is likely to be a substantial concern in basins where soil moisture and stream flows are high going into winter and river and lake freeze up. That really does depend a lot on what happens with the snowpack this year. If we get a typical plain snowpack, or it's a drier year or a warmer year, that could change. But it's something to keep an eye on as we move through the winter into the spring. El Nino. So we're kind of moving into the outlook portion of our talk here. So what's the El Nino conditions looking like for winter with 2018, 2019? Just to note there, those are 3 briefings that NOAA and our partners throughout the region have put out, kind of giving an overview of El Nino conditions for the region and what to expect. You can check those out if you'd like. Currently, we are in an El Nino watch. An El Nino has not been declared. That's actually because the water temperatures are there for an El Nino, but when the people who declare El Ninos are looking at the atmospheric circulation and the wind patterns, that's really not there to support it yet. So they're kind of waiting for those pieces to fall into place before they can declare it is an El Nino event. There's a good chance, 80% chance that likely development will occur through the winter months so that we will see an El Nino declared, and they have backed off the percentages moving into spring, saying there's a 55 to 60% chance that El Nino conditions would continue into spring. Historically, when we consider an El Nino for the central region, it's meant warmer than average temperatures in the north central states. With stronger El Ninos, that can be a more robust signal, but this is projected to be a weak El Nino, and that signal isn't as robust for those events. Precipitation is not as well correlated as temperature for the central region, and with that weak El Nino, that kind of changes a bit of what we're looking at. But this is just a chart showing the probabilities from the Climate Prediction Center and Erie at Columbia University, showing kind of the probability for El Nino conditions in 3-month blocks moving out into spring. And we'll see for November, December, and January, and the winter months of December, January, February, they're looking at 80 to 85% or so likelihood that there will be an El Nino event. And by the time we're out to late spring, early summer, we're down to about a 50-50 chance that we'll be back in neutral conditions. So the El Nino moving forward is projected to occur like 80% probability, but probably won't be a long-lived event if the outlooks are to be believed. Looking at what this means for our region. So we're going to parse out these weak El Nino events. These are two maps on the bottom showing standardized temperature anomalies. So it's not a direct degree Fahrenheit or degree Celsius amount, but it's showing how relatively warm or cold different areas of the countries are in weak El Nino events. And on the left there, you can see much of the region is actually showing below normal temperatures once you get east of the Dakotas and Nebraska there, but that's because there's 1976 and 1977 in there, which were two extremely cold years that happened to occur in conjunction with weak El Nino events. If you take those 2 years out and look at the rest of the weak El Nino events as a composite, what it really shows is that in the western parts of the region, so Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, and even over into Minnesota, Iowa, and Missouri, historically have experienced somewhat warmer conditions during weak El Ninos. By the time you move into the central Great Lakes and the eastern part of the region, your average temperatures with weak El Ninos are actually slightly below average when we look at all those historical analogs. So that is something that kind of departs from what we typically hear forecast with an El Nino event. Like we stated earlier, this is just a map showing precipitation anomalies associated with weak El Nino events. As you can see, it's really a mixed bag. Some years are drier, some years are wetter. It's just not a particularly robust signal for the region with those weak events. And then moving into the Great Lakes, just kind of the same take-home story from temperature is that these events tend to lean towards lower ice cover years in the Great Lakes Basin. So when there's even a weak El Nino event, they tend to be below average ice cover years, but normal and high ice cover years can and do occur more often so than with those stronger El Nino events. That's what that graph on the screen is showing there, with ice coverage on the y-axis and then El Nino ENSO phase on the bottom there. So ones right of that zero line would be warmer than normal sea surface temperatures, and above 0.5 there, that would be an El Nino event. So might have a lower ice cover year, but historically it's kind of all over the board with these weak events. Moving from the El Nino into the general climate outlook. So, we talked about what's happened, what the impacts have been. Kind of moving forward, want to touch on what the 7-day precipitation forecast looks like. So the next week, moving out towards Thanksgiving. We'll also touch on the 8 to 14-day outlook, so kind of what that week 2 outlook looks like, as well as December temperature precipitation outlooks, and then the winter season temperature and precipitation 3-month outlooks. These were just updated this morning, so you might have gotten it here first. Looking at the next 7 days for precipitation, a lot of the northern portion of the central region is showing that we'll see some precipitation, but that's in total liquid amounts. That's looking like it's anywhere between 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch across North Dakota there, down into southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, and then banking up through Illinois into Indiana and Ohio. Looks like there'll be a bigger winter storm off to the east, but that's kind of outside of our conversation here directly, though I know Indiana's seen some icing today and some snows occurring here currently. Over the next 7 days, most of this precipitation would likely fall as snow in this area. Nebraska, South Dakota, and the southern part of the states looking like it'll be dry for the next 7 days. And then Montana and Wyoming might see some pretty substantial snowfall in higher areas there if the forecast is to be, if it verifies. Moving out to the 8 to 14-day outlook. For temperatures across the region, the central part of the region, we're seeing about an equal chance of near normal temperatures. In the central part with the Dakotas, Nebraska, down into Kansas there, having slightly elevated chances of warmer than normal temperatures. Montana, the western parts of the region, Colorado and Wyoming are probably going to be near normal with these outlooks. And then on the right side of the screen there, that's showing probability of above or below normal precipitation. Much of the region is showing a slightly elevated chance of above normal precipitation for that week 2 outlook. And so what these outlooks show, I should say, if you're not as familiar with these, the lighter that color is, so like where we see the green on that precipitation map, the lighter it is, the closer it is to gray, that means that there's about a 33 to 40% probability of above normal conditions. So slightly, just a bit above, equal chances or near normal conditions. So those lighter colors, there's a bit more uncertainty with these outlooks moving forward. As we look into the next month for December, temperature outlook has changed a bit since the last month. We're showing slightly elevated probabilities for cooler than normal conditions in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, off into the eastern Great Lakes Basin, while much of the region is looking like it'll show equal chances. So equal chances being above or below normal temperatures. The outlook's just not favoring one way or the other. In the far western portion of the region, we're starting to see increased chances of above normal, higher probabilities of above normal temperature for the month of December. Moving over to precipitation, there are some elevated probabilities for above normal precipitation over Montana, Wyoming, the western Dakotas, and the western Nebraska there, with a transition zone of equal chances for above or below normal precipitation across Minnesota, Iowa, eastern Nebraska, Kansas, into Missouri and Wisconsin, while the eastern portion of the basin is actually showing elevated probabilities of drier than normal conditions for the month of December. Kind of concentrated, there's some higher probabilities up in the extreme northeast, Maine and New England, and then down into southern Missouri, northern Arkansas. But that's kind of the story, that transition from higher wet probabilities to higher dry probabilities as we move from west to east. And then the winter 3-month outlook. So this is showing the outlooks for temperature and precipitation for the months of December through February. And we're seeing kind of a more typical pattern that we'd associate with an El Nino event. That's what the outlooks are calling for, as well as kind of banking off current historical trend. Much of the region is forecast to have more higher likelihood of above normal temperatures for winter, kind of a band of 33 to 40% probabilities of elevated temperature, and then slightly higher probabilities as you move into the northern tier and the west of the region. When we look at what that means for precipitation, a lot of the region is showing equal chances, so for above or below normal precipitation, with the central part of the region and the central Great Lakes showing leaning towards drier in this 3-month outlook. So elevated probabilities that we might see some drier conditions in the central and northern parts of the Great Lakes region there. And then what does this all mean for seasonal drought outlook? So kind of what is the projection to happen for drought over the next 3 months as we move through winter into spring? And really, a lot of the drought, what's left on the landscape in the central region, is expected to persist according to this outlook. So in northern North Dakota there, central South Dakota, and some patches in Kansas, and then Colorado and Wyoming, most of it's expected to persist. Some improvement is expected in southern Colorado there, but it is likely to improve a little bit. But really, if there's drought on the landscape, a lot of improvement isn't forecast for the next 3 months for the central region. Just to summarize those outlooks as we move forward. So again, we're currently under an El Nino watch. That weak El Ninos generally favor higher probabilities for warmer temperatures in western portions of the region, near normal in the central to slightly cooler in the east. It should be said, though, that warmer does not mean warm. So just because there are higher probabilities for warmer temperatures doesn't mean that we're not going to see ice on our rivers, we're not going to see snowpack, we're not going to see all those things we normally associate with the winter. We still have to be concerned about ice up and things like that concerning water on the landscape. Looking at December, there's equal chances for above or below average temperatures in much of the region. It's leaning somewhat warmer in the west, and particularly the far western portions of the region, and somewhat cooler in the Great Lakes. Outlooks are showing that it might be drier in the central or eastern portions of the region and wetter in the southwest. And for the entire winter season, things are leaning a bit warmer in the north and west, a bit drier in the Great Lakes, and then some wetter conditions over Colorado and southeast Wyoming. I know we're going to have time for questions here in a minute, but just want to remind everyone, our partners that help all this take place, you can find today and recordings of past webinars on the two websites there. I'd also just like to mention the National Center for Environmental Information. You can see links there to monthly climate reports, as well as the Climate Prediction Center, NOAA's climate portal at climate.gov, and drought portal at drought.gov, also the National Drought Mitigation Center, state climatologists, and the NOAA regional climate centers for the high plains and the Midwest. And with that, happy to take some questions.
Thank you, BJ. That was great. You were very complete in all of that. We do have a number of questions I'd like to get through. I think Dennis had a point here.
Just one quick thing on soybeans. The reason there's such a concern about soybeans right now is that they don't handle adverse weather very well, and snow they don't handle very well. Corn that's left in the field has an ability to kind of last for a while longer. Soybeans don't. So that's why there's the bigger concern about them getting out of the field. And quickly, BJ, it's pronounced Belle Fourche, South Dakota, the local pronunciation.
Yeah, I realized that when I said it. They can take away my my South Dakota native card there.
Your passport. So yeah, one of the questions actually was, Dennis, is there a danger for corn and soybean yield loss at this time? I think you addressed that to some degree. There are a number of issues, weather-related issues, that can slowly degrade crops. And do you want to talk any more about that, Dennis?
Yeah, real quickly. Again, soybeans are the worst problem. The pods can shatter. The stems don't hold up very well. So there's just some of losing some on the ground, and then in moist conditions, BJ kind of touched on that too. Quality issues where you start getting molds and other things growing on some of these when they're in moist conditions. So it's a real concern, and that's why people want to get them out of the fields.
Yeah, that said, you still see traveling through the Midwest and Great Plains for that matter, huge piles of corn. You never see them of soybeans, and there's a good reason for that. And what I mean by huge piles, I mean huge piles that are trying to get transported one way or another, usually next to a train track. Anything you want to say about that, Dennis? Other than they exist. And you can ski down them, actually. Okay, so getting back to the questions, let me go up to the top here. Oops, can I get to the top? Yeah, well, one thing that was added, actually, not a question, was from Chip Zimmer out of Kentucky. He said the ice storm over the last 24 hours, really, have done quite a bit of damage to whatever soybean crops were still left in the field due to breaking off and falling over for the most part. And that the excessive rain also in that area, Kentucky, isn't helping matters at all in terms of getting the crops out. I don't know if there's any more you want to say about that. Another question from Bryce Anderson was, so we showed that map, and we showed all the places across the Midwest that have near record annual precipitation totals. The question was about why did that happen? So what was the pattern, if you will, the weather pattern that set up for that? And I do believe, if I remember correctly, it had something to do with April being cold, May being warm in some places. And then from then on, really a boundary that really didn't shift and kept places like Missouri in drought and dry, but north of there, crazy amounts of precipitation like you're showing.
Yeah, it was quieter in midsummer, but you're right. Spring, it was very wet there, and then it returned in the late summer, early fall.
And BJ, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Oh, I was just going to add it, and it was also, you mentioned like a boundary there. on the northern edge of that really wet zone, yeah, if you drove I-29 from, southern border of South Dakota up to the north part, you just saw this real transition, went from standing water in the ditches and cornfields to, pretty stressed looking crops by the time you hit the northern part of the state. So it was really focused in some parts.
Yeah, and I don't know if we can attribute that, what part of the global circulation pattern we can attribute that to. That is I would consider that a summer vagary. Now, the amount of precipitation, the amount of rain generally has been increasing for at least the last 50 or 60 years over that region anyway. So there's a tendency for wetter than normal conditions, or wetter than we've seen, I guess, on an average condition. But I guess this is just another one of those summer vagaries, I would call it. Okay, another question about the more recent cold that we've had across pretty much the entire region. Maybe more west to begin with, but now the eastern parts are getting a good taste of it. But any comment on the upper air pattern that evolved into this cold air and snow and ice that we've seen over the first part of November? Anybody have a comment they would like to share about that, other than early season cold air outbreak? I have noticed that parts of Alaska have been very, very warm.
Yeah.
Have we seen this at the beginning of some El Nino years where you have an early cold outbreak and then easing? I was trying to remember some years that we had seen this a couple times.
That is a great question. I don't. If we had someone like Michelle LaRue on, we could probably ask her that. But
yeah,
I don't have that memory actually.
Okay.
Yeah, neither do I. So that's an open question there.
Yeah, it can happen. I mean, obviously, in some cases there was some record cold. It wasn't all record cold. It wasn't a huge Arctic outbreak. I guess more of a Canadian outbreak than Arctic. But another question I never got an answer to, and I tried to find the answer and I couldn't find it quickly, was the period of record for those stream flows, the USGS map. That was a question. And I think the answer to that is that there's probably a minimum number. I don't know what that number is.
Doug, I did some quick looking, and the stations I was finding were generally 40 to 60 years. But you are correct that it is based on the station.
Yeah, so it's station based, but generally most of them are long-term stations.
Yeah.
Is there a day? Okay, we covered that one, and then another update on precipitation. So Lexington, Kentucky has topped 65 inches of precipitation for the year. That's a lot. And that's still an inch and a quarter away from their wettest year on record in Lexington, Kentucky, where it's been phenomenally wet. Also heard of wheat growers, according to Bryce, wheat growers in central Kansas calling it quits on wheat seeding because of wet conditions and extensive delays, I believe this fall, because of the wetness. So not good. I have a question from Benjamin asking about why the 2015-16 El Nino, and this actually leads to another thing I wanted to chat about really quick. 15-16 El Nino was so different, and I believe that was the monster El Nino, or whatever we called it, Godzilla El Nino or something like that. Is that right, guys? Am I remembering that correctly? 2015, 2016. I think that
memory serves. It was a stronger event. Yeah.
Yeah, that was that might have been one of the strongest of all. Yeah. What made that one atypical? That it was in the let's see, 2 degrees warmer than normal across the equator, which generally means there's a heck of a lot more energy to bring north. And yeah, as Bryce is telling me, it's the strongest since 97, 98, which is great. One thing I wanted to bring up is that, and this is no guarantee, but this happened actually previous to that super El Nino, was the year before that was trying to be an El Nino, kind of like this year, very weak, sort of disorganized, not sort of fulfilling its El Nino promise. And then because of the warmth that had built up, it didn't go away, it only strengthened. So the next year was extremely strong El Nino. Now, I'm not, again, it's not a forecast from NOAA. That is observation from the past. But there may be something to watch as we sort of get out of spring and into summer again. That.
The other thing we need to remember about El Ninos is we are somewhat displaced from where the El Nino forcing occurs. So there are other things that influence the impact of that El Nino on the continental U.S. There are other oceanic influences and atmospheric influences that connect those two. So it's not just a direct, if this happens, then this happens.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, Arctic oscillation is a big one to watch in the winter as well. That can really modify those conditions, and those are usually on a shorter timetable for predictability. So that's one thing to keep an eye on as we go into winter.
Yeah, and that's generally the eastern 2/3 of the U.S. are impacted by those, what we call the Arctic oscillation. Well, we won't go into a great description about, except to say that when it's negative, a lot of cold air is more available to come down in the eastern 2/3 of the U.S. Obviously, that's probably what happened in 76, 77, by the way. Okay, I want to move on. From a North Dakota perspective, when we give the probabilities of temperature and precip, this is something we're run into quite a bit. December is equal chances of temperature above, equal chances of temperatures and precip, and above, let's see, equal chance temperature and above precip. But when you give a 3-month outlook, yeah, that includes December, it's above temperature and equal chances for precip. Are we to follow the December forecast or the December, January, February forecast? Which is it's a legitimate question, and one that even can confuse us who do this on a daily basis. So, yeah, there can be, if the forecasters see that December is going to be unusually one way or the other, warm, cold, wet, dry, they will tilt the odds, like I guess it's up on the screen right now, in favor of whatever they happen to see in the models. Okay, in this case, a little bit wetter or better probabilities for wetter than normal. In this case, the Dakotas westward and south. Now show the December, January, February, the 3-month. Yeah, so there it goes away, and it's back to equal chances. What they're really saying there is, yes, we do think December in North Dakota, and it's not a lot of precipitation if you melt it all down usually, on average. What they're saying is December you're going to be above normal, more likely, but in January and February that's going to balance out, maybe even be a little bit below normal, so that when it all comes out in the wash, after those 3 months are over, and you tally all the numbers from those 3 months, it's going to be relatively close to normal. That's really what that forecast is saying. Same with temperature. You could say the same thing about temperature. So, and again, as BJ said, these 3-month outlooks are more based on a typical El Nino signature, as well as temperature trends and precipitation trends for that matter, but mostly temperature trends that we've seen with or without El Nino. So I hope that helps. Yes, they're different, but it's okay that they're different is sort of the bottom line with all of that. I don't have any other questions at the moment. I've just lost my dashboard to see who's still on here. But anyway, oh, there it is. It's snuck up. Any other comments or questions anybody has, or anything else? We're a little bit after 2, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to thank you again, BJ from Michigan State, and Dennis Toddy from USDA Climate Ag Hub out of Ames. Thank you so much for participating and partnering with us on this, and thank you all for staying in here so long and listening to all this great information from BJ. So we'll be back next month with our good friend Justin Gleason out of Iowa. So talk to you all later.